Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire, with Foreign Minister Jaishankar visiting Moscow on Monday the 7th and Tuesday the 8th, where the Ukraine crisis will be a major subject of discussion. We examine Russia's recent behavior in Ukraine, as well as the stand taken by the Indian government over the Ukraine situation. Joining me for this discussion is former Deputy National Security Advisor and former Ambassador to Russia, Pankaj Saran. Mr. Saran, let's start with Russia's recent behavior in Ukraine before we come and talk about the stand and position taken by the Indian government over the Ukraine crisis. First, how do you view Putin's repeated implied threats to use nuclear weapons and also to conduct exercises with his strategic nuclear forces? Recently, I know he has said that Russia won't use these weapons, but he did make these threats repeatedly not long ago, and certainly American generals don't take those threats lightly. So how do you view this threat to use nuclear weapons?
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Karan, for having me on the show. I think obviously no one would accept that these kinds of statements are not destabilizing, and they are a matter of great concern to not just the parties there, but to the whole world. However, I would also at the same time say that we need to look at the fuller picture. And the fuller picture is that, according to Putin, Western leaders have also been talking about the use of nuclear weapons. And according to him, he is responding to these threats, number one. Number two, he has not specifically used the term nuclear weapon. He has hedged around it, but not exactly talked about the use of nuclear weapons. And most recently, I think it was yesterday, that the Russian Foreign Ministry has come out with a statement outlining in great detail the Russian nuclear doctrine. So, but all in all, I agree that any talk of nuclear weapons is very troublesome. But I also must say that, Russia is actually, if one can use the word, one of the original nuclear powers. I mean, they have possessed nuclear weapons for the last 70 years. They have the largest nuclear weapons stockpile and arsenal in the world. That is the equivalent of the entire holdings of the United States, UK, and France. So we have to assume that there is a nuclear maturity in a power that possesses almost 6,000 nuclear weapons and warheads.
I'll just, for the sake of the audience, clarify that the Western leader who spoke about the possibility of using nuclear weapons was Liz Truss, and she did so in the summer before she became prime minister. She did so during that 6-week campaign runoff against Rishi Sunak. Now, the second key issue is, how do you interpret the Russian defense minister's phone calls to his counterparts in France, America, UK, and India, claiming that the Ukraine plans to use a dirty bomb, presumably on its own territory? Yesterday, inspectors of the IAEA have issued a statement to say they have found no signs whatsoever of Ukraine assembling a dirty bomb. So do you share the belief that's fairly widespread in the West, that in fact this claim that Ukraine is going to use a nuclear bomb is actually an attempt by Russia to create a cover behind which Russia itself might use a tactical nuclear weapon?
Firstly, I think in this kind of a situation, we have to take all accusations seriously because the matter is too serious. Number two, we actually do not have the full facts of the case. So making a accurate and a determined assessment of who is right, who is wrong is very difficult for us. What we can only do is to listen to the statements from both sides. And a few days ago, President Putin at the Valdai Club actually himself talked about this dirty bomb. And he said that we have concrete evidence where it is being assembled. It's using used nuclear fuel. They're probably going to use a truck, etc., etc. So now, unless, of course, we believe that everything he says is a lie, that's a different issue. But I would not agree, or I would not, my assessment is that I do not think he's making this claim to justify use by himself. I mean, that's an assessment that we have to make as India. But I'm also very interested to see the 4 countries that his defense minister spoke to. And to me, that's also an extremely interesting outreach to potential mediators in this conflict.
But what do you make of the fact that just yesterday, 24 hours ago, inspectors of the IAEA have formally issued a statement that they had unbridled access to whatever facilities in the Ukraine they wish to visit. And they say they have found no evidence whatsoever that Ukraine is assembling or has plans to assemble a dirty bomb. What do you make of that? Because that surely is refutation of Putin's so-called claim, which he made without providing any proof or evidence.
Yeah, in these kinds of situations, I mean, there are so many examples in the past of conflicts where we have listened to statements and counter statements. But if the IAEA has indeed made the statement, then it's a good sign and it's a good thing. But the only thing is, at the same time, leaked Western intelligence sources in the Western mass media are also saying they have found no evidence of mobilization of Russia's nuclear forces or nuclear weapons. So that is also another aspect of the whole situation.
Absolutely. Now, all of this is happening at a time when the Ukraine is making advances into Russian-held territories, and Russia's own generals are speaking about either how their progress has slowed down or in 1 or 2 instances stalled. In fact, now there is even press reports supported by Russian-appointed officials in parts of the Ukraine claiming that Russia could be considering withdrawing from Kherson. No matter how this issue ends, do you accept that this has damaged Russia's international political standing and the military reputation it had as a superpower? Both have suffered.
Yes, so on the first part, I think it has certainly damaged its reputation, but there are 2 qualifications. Number one, these are all transient matters. In the life of a nation, these episodes are not infinite. I mean, for example, we've had a 20-year war in Afghanistan. We've had military campaigns in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Libya, and so on. It's not so, yes, it is for the moment there is a damage, no question about it. Secondly, the damage is largely among the European countries and European nations and the Western allies. But if you look at the rest of the world, whether it's in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia or Africa, I think Russia is not going anywhere. And Russia's standing as a nation remains pretty much what it used to be. Insofar as the military reputation and pride is concerned, again, here I think we have to keep in mind, of course, there's damage, there's no doubt about it. But we also have to keep in mind that we have not yet seen the deployment of Russia's full military might in this conflict in the last 8 or 9 months. We have to keep in mind that when the Russian military machine was developed and nurtured and prepared, it was meant not to fight localized battles in Ukraine. It was meant to take on the entire might of the NATO. So the actual deployment and the availability of resources is very different. And so therefore, now, if you remember in the initial days, there was this huge narrative that the Russian military strategy has failed because he wanted to do a blitzkrieg in Kiev and take it over in a week's time, etc. I mean, even at that time, I had argued that no one knows that this was the Russian strategy, if it was just a conjecture and based essentially on Western mass media sources.
That point I fully accept. But is it not somewhat surprising, to put it mildly, that a superpower has taken 8 months and is still unable to vanquish the Ukraine? I know that Russia has the military capacity to blast 45% of Ukraine's energy sources and cut off its electricity. But that apart, Ukraine is not defeated, it hasn't surrendered. And if anything, Russia is now withdrawing from significant portions of territory it had acquired in the first 3 months. Isn't that surprising that it hasn't achieved a quicker, faster, more comprehensive victory?
No, I'm not sure whether he wanted to vanquish Ukraine and take it over. I don't think that was his intention. Now, this is, again, something which we are conjecturing. But if you hear again, Putin, again, a few days ago, he was asked this question that, people are questioning your military strategy. And what he said was, and it's a very interesting, that basically his focus was just on the Donbas. And he explained why they did what they did in the last 8 months. They tried to debilitate Ukraine's both physically and morally, their military power, so that finally, when matters come to rest, their entire military resources of Russia are focused only on the Donbas, on Lugansk and Donetsk. And this is basically what it appears to be, has been his strategy, rather than making Ukraine surrender to Russia.
Except that even 8 months after the war began, they haven't been able to get control of Donbas. And in fact, in Luhansk, they are now retreating. They are losing some of the territory they had. So if that limited objective was his intention, he hasn't achieved it even in 8 months. Surely that will make the world wonder whether Russian strategy, Russian equipment, whether Russian troop morale, whether Russian generals in command are really what people thought they were. Because questions have arisen, and I'm simply asking, do you think they're justified or do you think they're exaggerated?
No, I think these are exaggerated. I mean, you could make the same accusations for the American failure and the NATO failure in Afghanistan. I mean, there was actually no opposition, no organized opposition. And it took them 20 years, and they withdrew and they retreated and they were defeated. These things happen. I mean, I can give you another example where in Syria, Russia started its bombardment in 2015. And this was at a time when Bashar al-Assad was almost on the run. And yet today, he's back in power as the president. So, there are examples of both victory, defeat, successes, failures. And this is the nature of the beast, that, you advance somewhere, you retreat somewhere. And I don't think we should be taking a temperature every day about his successes or failures.
What about the response of the Russian people to the way the war has gone so far? For instance, mobilization has been extremely unpopular. Tens of thousands have actually fled the country, or so it's reported. And certainly there have also been protests within Russia. And Russian TV, according to Reuters, now has hosts who are acknowledging setbacks and searching for scapegoats. Now, you've lived in Russia, you know Russia, you were ambassador. What's your assessment of the response of the Russian people to the way the war has gone?
They are faced with conflicting emotions. On the one hand is the reality that every single Russian family has a Ukrainian relative, a brother, mother, father, sister, cousin. They are just kind of joined at the hip. So that's one reality. And they find it very uncomfortable that they are fighting with their own cousins. And of course, they are linked through language, through culture, and most importantly, through the Orthodox Christian Church. So that's one reality. The second reality is that there is a latent anti-Western feeling within Russia, because they are convinced that Russia has historically been wronged by the West. So there is a peculiar love-hate relationship. The elite, the rich, they want to send their children to Europe to study, they invest their money there. But on the other hand, there is this anti-Western sentiment. So it actually depends on who you talk to in Russia. Thirdly, we must remember it's a very sparsely populated country, 140 million people living in that huge landmass. So it's not as if you're going to see demonstrations of thousands of people coming out onto the streets. So there is a degree of sullenness about what is happening, but there is also a lot of stoicism about the Russian ability to handle crises and sufferings and sacrifice. So all this is part of, and lastly, I'll just say, popularity has never been a determinant of who occupies the Kremlin. That has actually been the history of Russia for the last many hundred years. So no one has actually won an election to reach the Kremlin, and nor has anyone had to leave the Kremlin because he has lost an election.
Quite right. The Russians for centuries have been used to autocratic rule. The crack of the whip, as I think Stalin once said, is something that the Russians not only understand but enjoy. One last question about Russia before I come to your assessment of how India has responded and handled the Ukraine crisis. How do you view Russia's decision to first suspend and then 3 days later resume the grain agreement that had been brokered by the UN? Is this a sign that Putin at some point has blinked? Is it a sign of confusion in the thinking in the Kremlin?
No, I think these are, again, tactical adjustments in an ongoing conflict. And
in 3 days flat?
Well, because, they went in for the Turkish mediated agreement in July. They adhered to it. Then they claimed that there was an attack on one of their ships in Sevastopol in Crimea. And so they decided to stop the movement. And now they've gone back to it. There were negotiations which involved Erdogan and Putin, and that led to the resumption of this agreement. So I wouldn't, so this is like, the kind of part and parcel of the whole conflict. For me, what is more important is the fact that you actually succeeded in having such an initiative. Today, it was about grain. Tomorrow, it could be about peace. And day after tomorrow, it could be about security. The fact is that there was a negotiating table. All the parties sat on it. They accepted Turkish and UN mediation. And today, this agreement, I believe, expires on the 19th of November. I think we should just hope that they renew the agreement.
Well, in fact, that's the other point. Not only within 3 days was there a very obvious and somewhat, some would say, embarrassing flip-flop by Putin, but now Putin is also saying he's not guaranteeing he'll renew it on the 19th. So there's a second flip-flop in the making. This is why I ask you, is this confusion? If it's not a sign of Putin blinking, is it a sign of a lack of clear thinking?
Not really. I think this is very typical Putin tactics, this hedging, annoying, and moving around and being tactically very, very adroit. And we will see more of this. I mean, for example, when they blew up the Kerch Bridge, he had an instant reaction. They've gamed each other completely, the Russians and the Ukrainians, and the Russians and NATO. I mean, this is their bread and butter, and they know each other's moves inside out. And we should never underestimate how much it's pretty much like India, Pakistan. So they know each other better than we would ever know them at all, in any case. And so, say, for example, when they blew up the Kerch Bridge, he responded within 24 hours. I mean, he had a response ready, and he had also anticipated that the Kerch Bridge would be attacked. So in this case, in the grain issue...
Hang on a second. Do you really mean that he'd anticipated that? Because if he had, he did absolutely nothing to prevent it. So it's a strange anticipation when you think it could be attacked, and yet the bridge is an open target which is badly damaged.
No, there was nothing he could do. I mean, there are weak points on both sides. Okay. I mean, for example, when you mentioned the power and energy infrastructure, we talked about the dirty bomb. This war is full of dirty tactics being used by both sides.
Okay, let's come now, against this background, to India's stand on the Ukraine crisis. I know we have defense and geopolitical interests that make it difficult for India to criticize Russia for invading a sovereign country. But on the other hand, we are extremely proud of the fact that we are the world's largest democracy, and we are great defenders of a rules-based international order. So our refusal to criticize Russia and vote against it at the UN has probably damaged our moral standing, even if it's protected our national interests. Was the trade-off acceptable?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in whose eyes did we lose our moral standing? I mean, that's the question. There is a vast swath of countries across the world who look up to India, who respect our views, and who emulate our votes. I mean,
but they haven't said a word about this issue. The countries that have spoken out and raised questions about this issue are the countries of America and Europe. And clearly, in the eyes of their government, although they express themselves with great dexterity, and more obviously in their print, which is more outspoken, our moral standing has suffered. They accept that we've secured our national interest, but the moral standing, which is also a national interest of the country, you can't say it's not our national interest, has suffered. Couldn't we have handled this matter more dexterously so that the damage to our moral standing didn't happen?
Yeah, so there are two parts to this. I mean, number one is, if you look at the record of these same countries that you referred to, I mean, look, we've lived through colonialism, apartheid, racism. Where were those moral values at that time? So there is a lot of expediency in this business.
But isn't this whataboutery?
Sorry?
Isn't this
no, it isn't
whataboutery?
It isn't, because, you know, as India, I mean, I have to look at all these facts of history also when I'm being judged by what I'm doing today or the way I'm behaving today. Secondly, we all know, for example, in the case of, let's say, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what is the standing or the postures many of these countries take when it comes to votes on Israeli actions against the Palestinians in the United Nations. So that's the first point. The second point is...
Can I interrupt at that point before
sure.
Second point? Sure. The audience will get the feeling that what you're saying when you compare us to other countries who let down their principles when it came to apartheid, what you're saying is, if others can let down their principles and get away with it, so can we. But that makes us just as good or as bad as them. The moral standing that we had as a country that lived up to its proud claim of being the largest democracy, the moral standing that we inherited Gandhi's values, he's the father of our nation, even if we honor him more in the breach than anything else, that moral standing has been damaged. And that stood us in great stead in the 60s and 50s. I know it's suffered thereafter, but it suffered grievously again.
No, I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, if you look at, let's say, for example, one particular vote in the General Assembly on the question of whether to remove Russia from the Human Rights Council, the vote is extremely interesting. I mean, the entire Middle East, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, most of Africa, India, China, we all abstained. So who voted in favor? There were very few. Of course, the vote went through, but the majority of the countries decided to stay away. So that's
let me give you another example. I think most people would accept that the vote at the Human Rights Council was not a moment when India let its moral standing down. But I'm talking about India's deafening silence when Putin was repeatedly threatening to use nuclear weapons. Now, you know this better than me, that India has traditionally taken a very strong position on the use of nuclear weapons, and we've been very outspoken about it. Surely we let ourselves down when we were silent. And surely our relationship with Russia and Putin in particular is resilient enough for us to say to him, this is one step too far. Withdraw your threat, whether it's outspoken or implied. It's not acceptable. And we can say these things politely rather than belligerently, but silence surely let us down.
No, firstly, it's possible that the Prime Minister in his calls to both Putin and Zelensky actually conveyed this message.
And it's also possible he didn't. We just don't know, which is why saying it publicly is important.
Yeah. No, on the public aspect, you know, when we had our standoff with China or with, let's say, we are engaged in similar standoffs, it is never the case that third countries, outside powers, give day-to-day commentaries on what is happening in the conflict. I don't think it is required or incumbent upon us to be commenting in a conflict such as this almost every second, third day.
Even though the non-use of nuclear weapons is something that's been a principle and a very cardinal principle of our foreign policy for decades. Even then, silence is acceptable.
No, so our position on the use of nuclear weapons is well known. I mean, we say this both in public as well as in the Conference on Disarmament.
But we didn't on this occasion. In this occasion, yes, we were mum.
No, but I don't think it is required for us to make statements because, you know, there are accusations coming out every day. I mean, the parties to the conflict, such as the European leaders, such as Ukraine, such as Russia, they are talking about this issue. I'm not quite sure whether it is required or necessary for India to jump in at every single statement made by either side.
Let me put another example to you. What about India's decision to abstain at the Security Council when Russian referenda and its annexation of Ukrainian territory was being voted on. After repeatedly saying that we support the UN Charter, was this not a strange and, I think I would add, an unbecoming decision by the world's largest democracy? Surely this is a moment when it would have been in our interest as a country, but also as a democracy and in our moral standing to say, hang on a second, you can't invade, then annex, and then hold fake referenda to claim it's legitimately yours. Surely here we should have stood by our moral constitutional principles.
No, I think there is the conflict is far more complicated and it is much more multi-layered than you are making it out to be. And I think you're holding India to standards which even the best in the world don't meet. I mean, being the world's largest democracy has nothing to do with it. I mean, these are hard strategic choices that nations make. For example, China doesn't worry about its image when it blocks the listing of terrorists from Pakistan. It's not really worried about whether it will be seen as a supporter of terrorism. And the United States has vetoed or voted against more resolutions on Israel than I can even count or that anyone can count. So that does not make the United States or Israel a less of a democracy.
Let me pick up on the point you made that these are complicated decisions, because actually it's a pretty complicated decision which India may have set the wrong precedent by. Would it not create problems for us now that we've abstained over the referenda and the annexation? Would it not create problems for us if Pakistan holds a referendum in POK and then changes its status from what it calls Azad Kashmir to a formal province of Kashmir? Indeed, Pakistan could use the same tactic of a referendum to justify the way they've absorbed Gilgit and Baltistan. And if they do that, we have set a precedent whereby our ability to complain and protest is undermined by what we did ourselves.
Consistency is neither an asset nor a requirement in international politics.
I admire your honesty, Mr. Saran. I admire your honesty.
That is the first rule of international politics. But secondly, your analogy, I would like to put it exactly the other way around. In fact, it is Pakistan who thinks that India is behaving like Russia. They actually behave as if Jammu and Kashmir is the Donbas of India. I mean, they have not recognized J&K's accession to India. They claim we are occupying it by force. They claim that every election in J&K was fake, that we have abrogated Article 370, that we have...
I don't deny any of that. But the point where the similarity is unfortunately worrying for us is that Pakistan has, let's say, annexed our territory. They've held on to it for 70 years. Now, if they were to hold a fake referendum and say that, in fact, the people have voted to become Pakistani and we're absorbing it fully as a province of Pakistan and not just as Azad Kashmir, which is the farcical way they call it, we would be in a terrible position, because how would we...
No. So if they absorb POK as a province of Pakistan, there'll be nothing better for us than that, because that will be the end of their international case on Jammu and Kashmir. And their foreign office mandarins know this extremely well, which is why they're not doing it.
Suggesting that we took this position on Ukraine deliberately to encourage Pakistan to make a mistake so that we could then say nothing better has happened as a result? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I'm suggesting that Kashmir is a separate issue. This is a separate issue, and there is no necessary parallel or precedent-setting quality on the decision we have taken. The decision we took was on account of many other geopolitical factors, also keeping in mind that tomorrow we will need the support of as many permanent members of the Security Council when we need that in the future.
We're coming to the end of this interview, but there's one other issue I want to raise. There's no doubt that it would be in India's best interest to find a way of bringing the war to a speedy conclusion. The question is, can India play a role in fostering negotiations, in bringing the two together? In Ukrainian eyes, I get the impression that we are judged to be far too close to Russia to be acceptable intermediaries.
They're probably right. I mean, historically, our relationship with Russia has been far more substantive than it has been with Ukraine. In fact, the Ukrainian relationship with Pakistan has been, in fact, much more robust than their relationship with us. But, it's tempting to play the role of a broker or a peacemaker. Now, in international conflicts, there is this concept called the tipping point. and there are people whose job it is to actually do this. I mean, and if you have not reached the tipping point of a conflict, then getting into mediation or brokering will be doomed to failure. So people know this, and this is actually true even, for example, in an India-Pakistan flare-up or an Israeli-Palestinian flare-up. And the conflict is being monitored through a microscope in Europe and in the United States. And in my opinion, the tipping point for brokering or mediation has not yet been reached, although people have tried. And there are 3-4 leaders who've done this.
But you're saying a very important thing. What you're doing is you're telling voices in India, and they come from across the political spectrum, that say that India should try and mediate between Russia and Ukraine. You're saying to those voices, first of all, we haven't reached that tipping point where either party would be amenable to mediation or the brokering of peace. But you're also saying something else. In Ukrainian eyes, we are not perceived to be neutral. Ukraine perceives us to be on Russia's side, which is why we wouldn't be acceptable as intermediaries to Ukraine.
No, I mean, it's not just Ukraine by itself. I mean, Ukraine is not acting on its own. I mean, it is also a proxy for the European Union. And
I think that's a bit unfair, surely. And Ukraine is a sovereign country which is getting assistance from Europe after it's been invaded. To say that it's acting as a proxy or a cat's paw is surely unfair.
No, I mean, look, you have to go back to the history of the conflict. It did not begin on the 24th of February. I mean, that again is a complete travesty of the truth. And the Europeans themselves acknowledge it, by the way, the Americans, and not just their officials, but even their strategic people. I mean, this goes back many, many, many years.
Absolutely. But if you go back in time, isn't there an agreement signed by Russia, America, the UK, and Ukraine, where Russia guaranteed to protect Ukraine's borders? Russia has backed off that agreement.
Yes, but that same agreement also made the Ukrainians guarantee the security and the integrity of Luhansk and Donetsk. That agreement failed to be implemented, and today the question is, who's
you are
responsible
accepting
for
the
that
Russian
failure?
line that the people of Luhansk and Donetsk, i.e. the people of Donbas, have been wrongly treated by the Ukrainians. You're accepting that Russian line because the Ukrainians staunchly deny it, and very few people in the West comment on it, leave aside, accept it. And certainly there's no opinion in India, but you're accepting that, in fact, Ukraine has mistreated Donbas.
No, I'm saying that even in the Minsk agreement, the guarantors to the Minsk agreement accepted the fundamental principle that both Donetsk and Lugansk were legitimate parties to the conflict. Why did they do it? I mean, that's a huge statement to make. And so I think what I'm only saying is that the relationship which India has with Russia is much more substantive, was much more substantive, but we have also in the last couple of years made huge strides in our relationship with the United States and Europe. That's also true, and which gives us confidence in those capitals.
My last question, and I'll ask you here to interpret what the Prime Minister meant. Last month, our Prime Minister spoke to President Zelensky, and he said, and I'm quoting him, there can be no military solution. And many people thought that this is a strange thing to say to a country that's been invaded. Was our Prime Minister suggesting to Zelensky that he should give up the territory Russia has forcefully occupied? Or does our Prime Minister believe that through negotiations, Putin will be willing to give up the territory he took over by invasion? I'm not quite sure what he meant, because I'll finish by adding this and then you answer. India would take it very badly if China were to cross over into Arunachal Pradesh or Ladakh, or if Pakistan was to walk across the LOC and the world were to say to us, there can be no military solution. We would not accept it. We would be offended by those words, what they said in those circumstances. And yet this is precisely what our Prime Minister said to Zelensky. And I'm not sure what he meant, which is why I'm asking you to interpret it.
Yeah, so look, on the Pakistan-China thing, that's exactly what the world has always said to us for the last 70 years. Whenever we've had a problem with Pakistan, no one has actually said, yeah, please go ahead and bombard Pakistan.
And we bridled when they said it. We didn't like it. We were offended. And yet we've said the same thing to Ukraine.
Yeah, but if you are going to draw a parallel between Pakistan and China, I would like to put it entirely differently. If you're drawing the parallel, then the parallel is different. The parallel is Pakistan is the Ukraine for us, and China is the NATO for us. And under the strategic cover of China, Pakistan is the one which has had aggressive designs and fought a proxy war against India. And if therefore the West has to do anything, it has to actually contain Pakistan's aggressive designs. But what we have found is exactly the opposite.
Saran, I accept the characterization you're making of Pakistan as Ukraine and China as NATO, but that's not quite what I was getting at. I was simply saying, if it's acceptable for us to say to a country that's invaded and whose territory is occupied by the invader that there can be no military solution, then what do we do when China steps into our territory or Pakistan steps into our territory and the world gives us the same answer? There's no military solution. We'd be offended if it was said to us, and yet we had no compunction saying it to the Ukraine.
No, there are some. See, firstly, this is a unrealistic scenario where India is not a Ukraine, right? So the scenario where Pakistan, this is a very expedient comparison, and it doesn't take into account the nuances of the conflict. Number one. Number two, what else would you expect the Prime Minister to tell Zelensky? Because they have also provoked. The fact is that provocations have come from both sides, and is it the case that you want to fan the flames of war?
Is it the Indian position that Ukraine provoked a Russian invasion of Ukraine? Is that our position? That in other words, Ukraine is to blame for the fact that it's been invaded?
Ukraine has been playing this game for years. And this has been on the table of the entire European security agenda since 2014. Okay. The Ukrainians know it. They know it better than you and I, what role they played. So that's the situation.
All right. I think we're going to have to end it there. Zoom has a terrible habit of cutting off after 40 minutes, but I'm very, very grateful to you, Mr. Saran, for having not just answered my questions, but answered in a way that I imagine reflects the real deeper thinking of the government, because as a former Deputy National Security Advisor, you know this much better than anyone else that I've had the privilege to interview. And therefore, from my standpoint and from the standpoint of the audience that's listening to you, you have provided, I think for the first time, a good understanding.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.